Hello and welcome to this video essay, Postmodern Politics in Rave, Chanel and Balenciaga. In lieu of a proper introduction, I'd just like to say that although the section about rave may seem incongruent with the fashion theme of this video, I left it in here because for me it was the first time I realised I'd been party to a postmodern experience, and that I felt I'd been missold a very commercialised clubbing experience as something that was part of the 90s rave lineage. So yeah, it may not be the most obvious starting point. To be honest, coherence has never personally been my skill anyway, but I think it's useful to be able to personally connect with experiences to help one understand philosophical theories.
I went to university in Manchester, and it has a reputation, as some may know, as a very culturally radiant city, with a rich history of musicians and scenes who made it their home. In the 80s and 90s, it was the origin of the Hacienda nightclub and Factory Records, which ran the club and signed bands such as Joy Division, New Order and the Happy Mondays, while also being regarded by some as the birthplace of acid house, although acid house as a genre started in Chicago. Vestiges of that era remain across the city in the names of buildings, and although there is still a lively club scene in the city, it's arguably a much more commercialised affair. While studying, I read Frederic Jameson's essay, Postmodernism, or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, which is the text I'm going to attempt to link this video to.
The term postmodernism was apparently first originated by Jean Baudrillard. Whenever I've attempted to research the roots of the term, there are loads of definitions which aren't relevant to what I'm trying to say here. Jameson describes specific concepts which are part of his postmodern critique, and I'll explain the ones I'm referring to.
Late capitalism is the notion that since World War II, capitalism has expanded to impact areas of life that had previously been sheltered from its impact. I'm not going to attempt to summarise the whole of Jameson's essay, but there are a few sections which are relevant for the purposes of this video. I am listing them forthwith. In his essay, Jameson describes the nostalgia mode in cultural production, an umbrella term which covers all creative productions such as art, literature, music, fashion, and architecture. The nostalgia mode is how Jameson describes trends based on past periods of artistic innovation, which utilise visual signifiers as their primary mode. In writing about the nostalgia mode, Jameson describes how pastiche eclipses parody as a dominant form of cultural production. Pastiche is, like parody, the imitation of a peculiar mask, speech in a dead language, but it is a neutral practice of such mimicry, without any of parody's ulterior motives, amputated of the satiric impulse, devoid of laughter, and of any conviction that alongside the abnormal tongue you have momentarily borrowed, some healthy linguistic normality still exists. I'm sure lots of people can think of examples of parody. I'm just going to use this one of Norman Fry from Little Britain making a press apology for accidentally having sex with men in public toilets.
I was then invited to join a group of gentlemen at a party in Brighton, where I was planning to give a talk about education reforms. However, shortly after my arrival, my clothes accidentally fell off. At that moment, I slipped on a glacé cherry and landed inside one of the men. As far as I'm concerned, that is the end of the matter. Thank you.
People from the UK are very familiar with this format. There have been a lot of sex scandals involving politicians. This is parody rather than pastiche, because the ulterior motive is to lampoon politicians and the bizarrely mediated PR pantomime form these apologies take. There is a motive behind the satire. Jameson describes pastiche, however. Pastiche is thus blank parody, a statue with blind eyeballs. It is to parody what that other interesting and historically original modern thing, the practice of a kind of blank irony, is to what Wayne Booth calls the stable ironies of the 18th century. I don't know who Wayne Booth is, let's leave him out of this. I'm not very original, but Madonna's Material Girl is kind of known for being a pastiche of Marilyn Monroe's Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend performance in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. Madonna's appropriation of the pink dress and gloves in a song celebrating materialism denotes an affection towards the original devoid of ridicule. She's playing the main character of a film after the death of its original cast member, thus fusing Monroe's image with her own. It's different to Little Britain's politician apology because Madonna isn't trying to take the piss out of Monroe or the song. She's just repeating it stylistically. Jameson also references the idea of a simulacra, which is a term mainly associated with Jean Baudrillard in his 1983 book, Simulacra and Simulation. First coined by Plato, a simulacra is a copy of an original which never existed. One of the most interesting current examples I've seen of a simulacra is provided by data scientist and Kardashian expert MJ Corey, which traces 4 stages of a simulacra via representations of Kylie Jenner. So in the first pic, this is Kylie, in other words, the sign, image or representation, au naturel, a basic reflection of reality, Kylie pre-lip filler, etc. The second phase is Kylie in the
wet ass P-word
video, looking gassed, lip fillers a go-go, a smooth, airbrushed vision. The third image refers to the impact on beauty trends Kylie's refined image had. The girls in the photos are referencing her signature pout and style, but she is absent from the photos. The basic reality of Kylie in the first image is hidden, because the girls are referencing an enhanced version of her. The fourth image is, from my research, some kind of paid Sims extension where you can get some kind of Kylie Jenner makeover for your Sim. I clearly don't play Sims, so apologies if I've got this wrong. But the idea is that the final image bears absolutely no resemblance to Kylie in the first picture, despite the fact that her image led to its creation. What the progression of the simulacra illustrates is that the image of this woman, which had a huge impact on the way that women across the world made themselves look, now exists in a context which doesn't even involve human faces, just avatars in a computer game.
I'm not going to summarise the rest of the essay. I will dig from bits of it, but these are the main concepts I'll be using.
Earlier in this video, I mentioned how Manchester is dotted with allusions to the era of rave. Names like Hacienda Apartments, new art developments called The Factory in honour of Factory Records. The titles of these buildings reference the 90s, but the social, economic and political context their current iterations now occupy is very different from the context that led to the birth of the rave movement. In a way, these buildings are copies of originals which never existed. I don't want to get too into the weeds of the origins of the rave movement in the UK because it's very rich and complicated. But the general consensus is that acid house emigrated from the Midwest of the US to the UK, with Manchester allegedly being where the UK acid house movement started. Most estimates say this was during the mid-80s, but in their essay, The Housing Crisis in Manchester, Capital of the Long 90s, authors Tom Gillespie, Isaac Rose, and Jonathan Silver, all members of Greater Manchester Housing Action, say the black clubs of Hume were playing acid house in the late 1970s. Anyway, at some point people started organising free parties in disused warehouses and council estates around the city. I feel like I'm supposed to give a reason or explain why people started having these parties, but I have no idea. Apparently the easy availability of ecstasy was a factor. In pretty much all the accounts I've read, however, there's a strong consensus that there was a certain ideology espoused by the rave movement that didn't fit with what the Tory-led government of the time expected from young people. I found this very instructive interview with photographer Matthew Smith in Good Trouble magazine. When asked about the overlap between political protest and the rave movement, Smith says, the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act linked all these things together in its criminalisation of rave, free parties and festivals, squatting, trespass and peaceful protest. It even removed the age-old right to silence. That, and the ongoing history of callous treatment of the public meted out by a Conservative government that had been in residence since 1979. It was also down to the attempt to introduce the poll tax, and again, the political violence unleashed against those who took part in the campaign of opposition against that. There was also the very visible mistreatment of the miners and print unions. They suffered the heavy hand of the state in their attempt to stand up for workers' rights. People found camaraderie, community, fun, and an outlet to counter a feeling of oppression in rave culture. For context, the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act was a 1994 bill, which was mainly brought about in response to illegal raves. I think Smith is suggesting that some of the clamping down tactics employed by the government created a kind of unholy alliance between different marginalised groups. So in Smith's account, rave exists within this broader political framework, which is about critiquing the mistreatment of protesters and workers. Smith says, the free festival scene in the UK had grown out of the 60s and 70s, and the amount of people choosing to escape the rent/mortgage trap by living on the road during the early 80s was massively mushrooming in response to housing legislation. This was also a time when government was selling home ownership to the population in a massive way, just in time for mass home repossessions caused by Thatcher's recession at the end of the 80s. I just thought I'd say here tangentially that although the threat of home repossession undermined the idea of buying a house, it's quite strange as an ageing Gen Zer to read about government selling home ownership to young people and those people rejecting it. I've never personally lived through a government that has seriously tried to make home ownership possible for young people, and basically any person on a low income without family help. Obviously, Thatcher's government started the decline of social housing by selling council houses to tenants, but with the knowledge of hindsight of how house prices were to boom and experience of unaffordable housing, I think many young people would find it hard to identify with this situation. Not saying it's a bad thing that people eschewed home ownership. I'm not trying to privilege check boomers. I guess it's just demonstrative of the fact that this was a very different time, which factors into the point I'm making about the breaking context between this era and the era of rave I lived through. Anyway, it's very important to note that a lot of the raves which occurred across the UK in this period were free parties. They weren't exclusively hosted in high-rent buildings in city centres, as most are today. In Manchester in 2023, for example, you could expect to pay £45 for a warehouse project ticket at a 40,000 capacity venue in the old Mayfield station. The organiser of said event, Sacha Lord, has a professional role as a nightlife ambassador for Manchester City Council in order to help him protect and advocate for the vast wealth generated by Manchester's nightlife scene. These industries obviously provide jobs for local people and generate taxable income for the city, but because of the price point, they will be unattainable for many inhabitants, clearly contrasting with the ethos of the initial rave movement. When I was a student in Manchester, the club promotion tactics would rely heavily on harking back to the rave lineage of Manchester. I think in youthful naivete, people definitely bought into the idea that our experience was a continuation of that era, except we were paying £30 entrance fees usually to dance in a designated club and buy £10 drinks, surrounded by other university students, often of similar backgrounds to our own. Rather than sauntering to Hume Crescents on some 50p disco biscuits. I don't know if these figures are accurate, but you get my drift. Gillespie, Rose and Silver focus on the concept of urban entrepreneurialism, which is an economic model the authors argue Manchester has followed, whereby many of the city's cultural exports have been appropriated for commercial gain, while the conditions that allowed those scenes to flourish have been extinguished. One of their main targets is the Factory, the new permanent home of Manchester International Festival, which is a reference to the record label Factory Records. They write, Factory Records and the Hacienda are well known, but these represent merely a fraction of a complex ecosystem of venues, record labels, pirate radio stations, pub side rooms, and artist studios. The roots of Manchester's house music scene of the 1980s lay in the black clubs in Hume and Moss Side, which from the late 70s onwards were playing the new music coming out of New York and Chicago. Undergirding all this cultural innovation was a crucial material factor, cheap space. This was typified by the role Hume's crumbling brutalist council estate played in incubating the city's now mythic post-punk scene of the 1970s and 80s. Despite the habitual references to Factory Records and the Hacienda in urban boosterist discourses, there is a persistent sense that Manchester's elite rather missed the point of what enabled the innovation of this era, and where the roots of the culture were. So we're now left with a city which has the same place names that existed in the rave movement, but none of the social and economic factors that made the scene possible. What this illustrates for my purposes is this tendency of skimming off the most nostalgia-friendly cultural signifiers of an era, which was about much more than just music and famous clubs, and presenting it as a continuation or revival of that exact thing. Usually this revivalist tendency serves the interests of capital, with Gillespie, Rose and Silver noting that one significant financial interest is the property developer Allied London, who acquired the Granada Studios site during their development of the adjacent Spinningfields district. Allied London planned to develop the site around the Factory into St John's, a 25-acre mixed-use neighbourhood including apartments, hotels, offices and retail space. The authors reference geographer David Harvey's argument that urban cultural spaces often come to serve the interests of capital accumulation by attracting new flows of investment and inflating land rents. In the case of Manchester, the presence of the factory is certain to increase property values on the Citron site. As explained before, the rave movement was born out of an availability of cheap space, but the fruits of that era have in this case been copied and pasted, corp style, into a context which it could never have existed in its true form. Something born out of cheap space has been subverted in order to increase land rents, so we're left with a simulacra, a copy of an original which never truly existed in the way we currently experience it. As DJ and writer Dave Haslam observes, the Hacienda wasn't a disco version of the Trafford Centre. Just an FYI for people unfamiliar with the Trafford Centre, it's this very uncanny purpose-built shopping centre with all these insane neoclassical accents and marble floors. I would even argue that the Trafford Centre is a simulacra in itself. In the words of Jameson, it randomly and without principle but with gusto cannibalizes all the architectural styles of the past and combines them in over-stimulating ensembles. It feels like the style which you see in famous buildings throughout Europe, buildings which were often built for the collective use of thousands of people to allow them to take part in worship and governments, appropriated to create this kind of temple-esque shopping centre. Like, this picture is just giving Westminster Abbey for me. It's so bizarre. So concludes section 1 of this video. Cultural heritage, which has specific political and social DNA, is often co-opted by corporate interests, and it's all very postmodern. Fashion is really good at this technique of disinfecting social/political movements of their radical ideology and elucidating or mining some kind of marketable aesthetic. I feel like the most on-the-nose example of this is the Chanel 2014 runway show, in which models paraded slogans with captions such as "History is her story" and "Ladies first." Many critics at the time referred back to memorable Lagerfeld comments on famous women, for example calling Adele a little too fat, and saying of Kate and Pip and Middleton respectively, "I like that kind of woman. I like romantic beauties. On the other hand, her sister struggles. I don't like the sister's face. She should only show her back." I'm not sure I need to go into detail about why this is a sexist thing to say, and obviously coupled with the fat phobia towards Adele, I mean it's hard to square some of these comments with the sentiment of the Chanel runway. The reason I think this example is interesting is that, in fairness to Karl Lagerfeld, I don't think he was as dishonest as some designers/cultural producers are about the fact that he had no real ideological commitment to feminism as a philosophy, stating that, "I like the idea of feminism being something light-hearted, not a truck driver for the feminist movement." Here I don't really see him sincerely attempting to defend the disparity between his sexist comments and the sentiment of the runway show. He's literally admitting that he sees feminism as light-hearted, a mere visual motif to adorn his vision. For me, this is an example of what Jameson is articulating in Pastiche Eclipse's parody. Lagerfeld is donning the cloak of feminism, and it's definitely a certain brand of BuzzFeed girl boss feminism, which is often parodied and ridiculed online. But it doesn't feel like his playfulness with it is in the service of any particular goal, like the ulterior motives of parody that Jameson describes. I mean, I guess it's in the service of creating his vision and selling the collection, but there's nothing in it which causes us to look deeper or mentally engage with feminist themes. I wouldn't really say he's taking the piss out of women and therefore parodying feminism as a philosophy, although I guess you could read him in that way if you argued that the mainly white, thin models are all representations of repressive sexist beauty standards. But the support for women's rights clearly doesn't extend beyond the runway. Slogans such as "protect garment workers" would have been a lot more compelling than "boys should get pregnant too" if Lagerfeld really wanted to make a feminist statement. By the way, in Fashion Revolution's Transparency Index 2023, which ranks 250 of the world's largest fashion brands and retailers based on their public disclosure of human rights and environmental policies, practices, and impacts across their operations and supply chains, Chanel only scored 11%, so Karl would hopefully have been dragged if he'd made a slogan like that anyway. I find all the slogans really relevant to this idea of pastiche. They're just all so vacuous. They read like they're written on the office walls of some New York girl boss hunty. I think there's a comparison to be made between who the beneficiaries are in Chanel's appropriation of feminism and in the profit-making undertones of Manchester's rave renaissance. Chanel is owned by the billionaire Wertheimer family, so you see the same dynamic of the aesthetic of social movements being instrumentalized in order to generate more wealth. However, in a way, I personally find this appropriation less egregious than the misrepresentation of rave culture in Manchester. I think it has something to do with how silly it seems. There are a bunch of articles slamming Lagerfeld's feministism when it first came out, and I think because of occasionally accurate Zoolander-esque tropes of what people in the fashion industry are like, it was met with a generalised eye roll by more serious media. Side note on the topic of Zoolander-esque tropes, I went down a Google rabbit hole on the time that John Galliano told his stylist to buy the clothes off a homeless man's back because he was inspired by them. I digress. I think people don't take fashion that seriously as an art form, and so people don't get as riled at its creative content. Sometimes I feel like this is because fashion is coded as very feminine and therefore kind of frivolous. But I also think it's because fashion media doesn't critique creative output in the way that art and fashion critics critique art and film. The art world runs on multi-million-pound sales, and Hollywood makes its stars rich. But this other arts media is still often able to achieve some critical distance from its subject, and consistently levies a broad range of critiques at it. When I described serious media dismissing Karl Lagerfeld's feminist runway, I didn't include Vogue magazine in that category. Sarah Mower of Vogue described how today's Chanel show was only the most public demonstration that fashion is marching hand in hand with feminism. To be fair, Elle magazine seemed pretty aware of the capitalist subterfuge of Lagerfeld's sudden politicism, with Leah Rose Chernikoff suggesting Lagerfeld was co-opting feminism. But nothing was said about the fact that Chanel consistently scores so low on transparency indexes for labour practices and ethics. Neither Vogue or Elle writers highlighted the sexist comments Lagerfeld is responsible for. I think this is possibly due to the alliance between fashion print media and brands who are always paying them for advertorial content and keeping them afloat financially. It's not really in fashion media's vested interest to seriously critique the brands that pay them to the extent that the criticism could harm the magazine's relationship with the brand. I will come back to this later. In conclusion to this point, I don't even hate Chanel feminism. I find it funny and fairly impotent as a way of seriously co-opting a political movement. But it is also very, very postmodern. So, pre the infamous ad scandal of 2022, Demna's tenure at Balenciaga was characterised by his signature baggy cuts and so-called subversive fashion. I've read in lots of interviews that he sees himself as an outsider. A former child refugee from Georgia, he came to the fashion industry with no prior connections, with the feeling of otherness pervading his childhood growing up in Germany. In a March 2023 interview, Lauren Collins in The New Yorker described how Demna was born in the Soviet Union, that immense and now non-existent country, he once wrote. His father, Guram, is Georgian. He was a car mechanic and a hot rod enthusiast. His mother, Elvira, is Russian. She was a housewife. They raised Demna and his younger brother, also named Guram, in Sukhumi, a resort town on the Black Sea. Privacy, solitude, and individual possessions were scarce commodities in their home. A three-house compound they shared with a gaggle of relatives, paternal grandmother, uncles, cousins. What was theirs was Demna's, and what was Demna's was theirs. Demna has joked that the best-dressed member of the family was whoever got up first in the morning. He remembers the smell of inkjet printers and glue, his tink or a hustler dad in the garage whipping up a DIY American-style t-shirts and sneakers to sell on the black market. For the community that Demna grew up in, fashion wasn't seen as a viable career path for someone of his background, or indeed gender, and his love of fashion often made him feel out of place and misunderstood by his family. Vetements. Before becoming creative director at Balenciaga, Demna set up a brand with Guram called Vetements, for which he designed the infamous DHL t-shirt, which retailed for £185. I've read in interviews with Demna that the name Vetements, French word for clothes, is meant to reflect the brand's love of the mundane and its penchant for simple silhouettes. But I also think that Demna is toying with well-known marketing tools with this name, the idea that everything sounds more sophisticated and luxurious in French. Demna actually says the idea of the DHL t-shirt came about because DHL was such a prevalent feature of Vetements' early inception, due to problems with the delivery company. Demna said he thought DHL was going to run his business to the ground in an interview with The Telegraph in 2016. I somewhat accept this description, but I also think that there's another side of the DHL t-shirt worth examining. The deliberate irony that there are people who wear the t-shirt to do their minimum wage jobs, yet a luxury brand is selling the same t-shirt to far wealthier customers for £185. In interviews, Demna has definitely touched on the fact that his price points are exclusive, stating that a lot of his friends can't afford to buy his work, which I think is interesting as it suggests that from the beginning, the clear intention was to make money as opposed to creating a brand that catered to himself or people like him, his friends, etc. Full disclosure, I run a small brand, and price point accessibility is definitely something I talk about with my other designer friends. I know a lot of people who feel really bad raising their prices, which is very difficult not to do when some stockists take upwards of 50% commission. I personally find pricing really fraught. I tend to think that most people really have no idea about how much clothes should cost if the people who made them are paid properly. Never mind the fact that a garment price also has to be reflective of materials, obviously higher if you're using more sustainable materials that weavers are paid properly for, studio rent costs, the rent costs of the stockists who stock the clothes. Because I sew and buy fabric, if I see a new dress selling for £10, I know for a fact that multiple people have been exploited in order to produce it. But I think globally clothing prices are so depressed that it's genuinely difficult for most people to fully comprehend this because they have no understanding of production. Even in casual conversation, I notice that lots of people balk at the idea of spending £100 on a garment, even though that price point for a well-made shirt is entirely reflective of an adequate wage for labour and material costs. I'm not saying everyone who can't afford to pay that much for clothes is immoral. I just think it's interesting that I've heard this said by financially comfortable extended family, like in this kind of middle-class veneration of thriftiness way. The market is so expansive, and it's your role as a sharp-eyed consumer to find the best deal. I've seen a lot of TikTok debates about how it's good that fast fashion exists, as it's accessible, but I just think that it's only accessible at the cost of the exploitation of garment workers in the global south. Anyway, back to DHL. I googled organic cotton by the metre, and it's about £15. Say you'd need 2 metres for the largest size, probably an overestimate. That's £30, though way less because businesses buy fabric at wholesale prices. I'm just going to say 20. I don't think these were made from organic cotton realistically. I'd be shocked if materials were any more than a tenner for this. Whatever, £20 plus half an hour's worth of work, say the worker is paid £30 an hour, probably an overestimate again. I reckon the production costs of this were like £35. Let's say Demna/Vetements add £35 to sell it for 70, doubled in case the stockist takes 50%. That's still 140, still not hitting 185. By the way, I consulted an inflation calculator. 185 in 2015 is apparently worth 250 in 2023. So even with this probably overestimated production costs, it's abundantly obvious that the price of this t-shirt does not reflect the price of labour and materials used to produce it, and that Vetements will make a huge profit from this. By the way, this is kind of a simplification of how pricing would work, as some of the Vetements stockists would take more than 50%, while they would get 100% of the retail price if they sold direct to consumers from their website. So you'd have to take a look at the average profit made across all stockists to get a realistic idea of profit making. But I'm a designer, most of my prices are under £250, and they're for far more complicated designs than a t-shirt. What I'm trying to emphasise with this explanation is that Demna is trying to make way more profit on this shirt than the production cost would suggest he could, by leveraging the cultural value of the Vetements brand. Karl Marx has provided an analysis of the monetary values we ascribe to commodities, so I'm going to try and explain it in relation to this t-shirt. Use value in classical economics is value which is only realised in the consumption or use of a commodity. So like if you wore this because you needed a t-shirt to smoke some meat. According to Google, use value is also supposedly reflective of what general consumers would pay for a commodity, which in the case of a t-shirt is kind of problematically low because of the underpayment of garment workers globally. The exchange value of a commodity in late capitalism isn't very reflective of use value at all. It's the value for which you can exchange goods. Designer clothes are often expensive because of their brand and the value people place on it. Vetements was a very hypey brand when they designed this t-shirt in 2015, and clearly lots of people thought its price tag was deserved. People probably didn't buy this t-shirt because they needed a t-shirt to do any specific activity. Maybe look fly at a party? But yeah, £185/250 is not reflective of the use value of this t-shirt. Unless you count looking fly as a use, I don't know, I'm confused. Anyway, I mean all this to say that Demna has never really set out to make good quality clothing at prices reflective of labour and material costs, and all the other costs I mentioned. He's very much someone who went in with the intention of becoming mega rich, who has built Vetements inside the bosom of the fashion elites. I can't relate to being a refugee, so I don't feel best placed to judge him. I guess that he just wanted to experience social mobility through his work. But I do personally think that extending price far beyond the costs associated with actual production because you're able to, because you're a luxury brand, does play into notions that some labour is more valuable than others. It clearly alienates the consumer from the manufacturing process, and in doing so helps obfuscate the role of garment and textile workers by deriving value from brand identity as opposed to being reflective of people's labour. I think it's useful to talk about the artist Santiago Sierra when examining Demna's oeuvre. Demna has collaborated with him multiple times, and I found this interview he did on some Art Basel podcast in which he describes feeling a deep identification with Sierra's work. Quick overview for those who don't know. Santiago Sierra is an artist who makes highly controversial work, which seems like the abuse of members of marginalised groups, but in doing so arguably highlights wider structural abuses in society. For example, the 160cm line tattooed on 4 people. Sierra paid 5 heroin-addicted prostitutes the price of a shot of heroin to get a line tattooed on their backs by him. At first glance, the work appears violently misogynistic, Sierra's pen permanently maiming the women with its ejaculation. Sierra's point, however, is that if he hadn't paid these women to get a tattoo and be in his film, they'd have had to perform sex work, or in this case arguably survival sex, in order to afford their shot. It just wouldn't have been visible to gallery goers. That this piece ends up serving as entertainment for the wealthier people in the gallery space further underscores the cruelty of what Sierra is exposing. Exploitation of the poor becomes entertainment for the rich. So I guess the comparison is that while Vetements' £185 DHL t-shirt appears to be a joke at the expense of DHL workers to have their uniforms sold to rich people for probably double what many of them are earning in a day, Demna is just highlighting the cruelty of capitalism and making an ironic statement about luxury. I think there's a similar quality in the work of Sierra and Demna of exposing middle and upper class people to the struggles of the working class and other marginalised groups, but inside this highly mediated entertainment space, which in my opinion encourages a kind of sadomasochistic self-flagellation on the part of the audience. Demna quotes Sierra in saying, "He gives the high society and high culture the mechanisms to unload their morality and their guilt." And in the interview, Demna said he thinks he does the same thing in fashion. Many critics have described how Demna creates an uncomfortable environment at his shows. For example, collaborating with scent artist Cecile Tolas to create a mud scent at the Autumn-Winter 2022 show, which according to Alexander Fury stuck to the show attendees' clothes, which critics seem to interpret with the sense that he was branding the audience with muck, with mud being a metaphor for low culture. So I guess that in the way that Sierra's audience become unwitting consumers of his exploitative work, ridiculed by their complicity in the abuse, the attendees of the Balenciaga show are treated as greedy pigs, eager to be served caviar but offered gruel instead. You could argue that in a way, buyers of the Vetements DHL t-shirt are technically buying into the notion of themselves as label-crazed consumers who buy overpriced shirts because they're branded, when they know they could buy the same one from actual DHL for £8. Sierra and Demna both have a seemingly parasitic relationship with the rich and the poor. In Demna's case, wealthy people buy the Vetements DHL t-shirt and the distressed Balenciaga shoes, which are kind of taking the piss out of them, in order to attain cultural capital and make them feel part of an in-group. But he also needs the working class in order to mine their identity signifiers. Sierra has made a career relying on the marginalised to offer him subject matter. His most recent cancellation was when he proposed to drench the Union Jack in the actual blood of Indigenous people in order to make a statement about colonialism. But he also needs the wealthier art audience to be shocked and offended by it in order to have a career and give him cultural relevance. One key difference I'd point out between Sierra and Demna, however, is that a lot of the irony, or blank irony in the words of Jameson, is arguably merely a tool Demna uses to sell stuff. Sierra obviously makes money from his art, but he's also recognised the conflicted position this puts him in considering his capitalism-critical subject matter. There's a level of awareness there. I don't personally always buy that being aware of something necessarily neutralises the critiques people may have of it, but I do think there's slightly more artistic autonomy in Sierra's case than in Demna's, because his success doesn't depend so heavily on consumers buying his work as a commodity or at the behest of a billionaire owner. It also depends on what value often publicly funded institutions see in it. For example, I saw a video of a 160cm lion tattooed on 4 people, I think at Tate Modern, which was on display in their permanent collection at the time, which is free to visit. I feel like you could say a lot of stuff about how messed up and nepotistic the art world is, and how a lot of art just ends up existing as speculative assets for the ultra-wealthy. Just in most countries, there is at least one free place you can go to experience art. There aren't as many state-led fashion institutions which are free to visit. I guess partly because of the dual nature of fashion as a commodity as well as a form of cultural production. Like H&M has claimed that it democratizes fashion by exploiting garment workers in the global south. I wonder what free, state-led access to fashion would look like, actually. Anyway, this is a tangent. Regarding the fashion industry, something that is apparent to everyone who works in fashion is that the industry is about business and marketing. Arguably, I definitely think this is true of the big brands, more about marketing than design. Santiago Sierra also takes on jobs for corporations, like when he collaborated with Demna for the Mud Runway in autumn 2022, but he's not necessarily creatively beholden to the money-making demands of a large company. He picks and chooses work when it suits him. In his capacity as creative director for Balenciaga, Demna's primary role is to create demand for his work in order to generate revenue for its parent company Kering, owned by billionaire François-Henri Pinault. I do think this structure engenders the type of cultural production Jameson describes in his essay, when he writes that what has happened is that aesthetic production today has become integrated into commodity production generally. The frantic economic urgency of producing fresh waves of ever more novel-seeming goods, from clothing to airplanes, at ever greater rates of turnover, now assigns an increasingly essential structural function and position to aesthetic innovation and experimentation. I do find this statement so relevant to fashion production as a whole, since as long as I've been alive, the impetus for new collections feels entirely dictated by economic needs as opposed to creative expression. On a personal level, I'm rarely inspired by the collections of mainstream top fashion houses. I just find a lot of it lacking in originality, and I can't help but be confused by the sheer scale of production at a time in which the climate crisis becomes ever more evident. It just feels like no one dares to conceive of the fashion industry as anything other than an economic device with which to aggressively sell products. This is reflective by what I've read in the limited time I've spent perusing fashion commentary. This hyper-capitalist structure is rarely critiqued. I'm also struck by the lack of criticism it levies at designers and brands for their actual creative output. Sure, there are accounts like Diet Prada which call out problematic marketing techniques and report on legal cases in the fashion industry. But in researching criticism of Demna as a designer, I haven't really found much that critiques his actual clothing. In February 2023, Eugene Rabkin, who is someone I've been listening to a lot, shared his thoughts on why he thinks Kering let go of the wrong creative director when Alessandro Michele left Gucci while Demna stayed at Balenciaga. He talks about being quite bored by Demna's recent output and how he thinks it lacks creativity. But that's quite rare. I guess maybe because people/fashion media are aware that the clothes aren't necessarily meant to be new or creatively inspiring. They're just ideations of a brand and its aesthetic signature. Like it's obvious to people that aesthetic production has become integrated into commodity production generally, because clothes are commodities. The commerce element of the fashion industry is inherent in its design at this point. And in the case of Demna, it feels like an accepted fact that his skill in building a brand identity is what encourages consumers to buy his work, rather than the clothes themselves. I'm aware that it's not really a hot take to argue that the entire fashion industry in its current form is essentially dependent on the financial success of conglomerates carrying an LVMH, with many thousands of fashion industry workers deriving their income in part from these companies, including journalists who work for magazines sponsored by them, which is again probably why you don't see this type of criticism in Vogue or Elle. People who work in fashion aren't oblivious to the profit-making constraints which patrol the borders of the kinds of garments which get created by designers. And I think some therefore just choose to analyse runway presentations as a medium in and of itself. I found this piece by Alexander Fury looking at Demna's Autumn-Winter 2022 show, featuring the catwalk made of mud. In it, he describes trainers, torn, stained and worn by hand. They took hours of work. The same kind of time-intensive labour that would normally go into, say, sequining an evening dress or tailoring a tuxedo. Putting luxury fashion into the box of polished, exclusive, and visually expensive is limiting and pretty old school, Demna wrote. What he seemed to be asking through this show is, why is one more worthy, more desirable than the other? Can't they both exist? Isn't there a validity to both? I think what Fury expresses is the fact that Demna is playing with the concept of the luxury brand itself, warping its definition by encouraging the viewer to reimagine staining as an artisanal technique. This was the runway which featured the earthy mud scent, and I think there's a parallel between the conception of perfume as an exotic cocktail of rarefied scents and the creation of an aroma that stinks of something associated with the uncivilized, with both scents requiring the same degree of painstaking artisanal knowledge to produce. I'm quite persuaded by Fury's critique here because he contextualizes it within the luxury fashion industry itself, rather than extrapolating the themes Demna plays with outside of fashion, which in my view is what the Vogue piece did with Karl Lagerfeld's feminist runway. That critic seemed to accept that there was something truly politically radical in Lagerfeld sending models down the runway with feminist signs, whereas Fury treats Demna's runway show as an art piece and analyses the way it made him feel. When engaged with in this context, I can kind of get on board with Demna's oeuvre as a designer. He's occupying this liminal space between the world of luxury fashion and the street. There's something kind of Andy Warhol about his appropriation of brands, and it's definitely a break from what is expected of a luxury fashion designer. I definitely personally think that Demna is more creative in this sense than someone like Eddie Slimane. No offense, I just really don't see why people are obsessed with him. He seems to just make variations of the same 70s/indie sleaze look, and his casting is definitely stuck in the early 2000s. But yeah, I can see how, within the hyper-capitalist constraints of fashion, Demna is an interesting presence, even though I find some of the clothing slightly boring. I'm a bit less sold, however, when Demna has attempted to attach other political themes to his work in this way that kind of treats some political issues as separate from all other external factors. Namely, that he discusses political themes without a thorough recognition of the hyper-capitalist environment he finds himself in, even when the political issues he examines are enmeshed within it. We know he is aware of capitalism, think sending models down the runway and carrying branded jumpers, but the acknowledgement of the profit-driven capitalist business model he inhabits feels absent when he talks about other issues. I felt this was clear in the Spring-Summer 2023 runway, which he described as being about climate change, and then, after the February invasion of Ukraine by Russia, about refugees. On the climate change theme, firstly, I don't know, I just found the premise a bit unrealistic. He staged a snowstorm because in his mind, climate change means no snow, so people will want to simulate snowstorms as a form of entertainment. It's worth pointing out that this is not a very accurate prognosis according to most climate scientists. Climate change is likely to make weather more extreme and unpredictable, and although some scientists suggest that snow could disappear from some countries in the West, from my shitty 5-minute research, it seems unlikely to completely disappear globally, with research suggesting that snowstorms could become more intense in certain areas. He also flooded the runway for Autumn-Winter 2020, which was apparently also a comment about climate change. I guess there's an interesting dynamic in the sense that the viewers of the Balenciaga show are towards the upper echelons of society. And so there's this kind of Hunger Games-esque energy to being able to simulate extreme weather conditions for owners of private jets, when countries in the global south are experiencing them as a fact of life. Like, that is very Santiago Sierra, but I'm not even sure that was actually what he was going for. Certainly the fashion press didn't pick up on it, and uniformly seemed to suggest of the fall 2020 flood show that Demna was earnestly trying to draw attention to climate change. Critics noted that although the water usage appeared wasteful, the water from the flood was then recycled to be used as grey water in Paris. In my opinion, this critique kind of exemplifies what I'm trying to explain about Demna's politics and their critical reception. The focus seems to be about Demna's exciting runway show and whether the presentation counteracted the message, whether using loads of water is a good way to draw attention to climate change. But there's no interrogation of the fact that the fashion industry's contribution to carbon emissions is estimated to be between 2 and 8%, and that as a designer who comes out with 4 collections a year, Demna and Balenciaga sit at the heart of that issue. I've mentioned before about how I think it's a weird argument to say that hating on fast fashion is elitist, but it's luxury brands which set the tone for the cyclical, unending carousel of consumption that is the season system. Anyway, the 2023 Blizzard show spontaneously got changed to also being about refugees after the February invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Demna read a poem out in Ukrainian, and Balenciaga made a donation to the World Food Programme. What I'm most dubious about is the way in which Demna seemed to present the show as an actual piece of political rebellion against Putin. I've read a bunch of quotes about his unsureness about putting on the show, stating that, in a time like this, fashion loses its relevance and its actual right to exist, which I take at face value. It must have been hard for him as a former child refugee to be working on a fashion show during such an emotive conflict. But he also said, "But then I realised cancelling the show would mean giving in, surrendering to the evil that already hurt me so much for almost 30 years. He continued, "It is a dedication to fearlessness, to resistance, and to the victory of love and peace. And so, after a lot of soul-searching, it went ahead." Call me cynical, but I'm not sure Putin was quaking in his boots just because Demna decided to put on a runway show. We'll never know how close of a call it was regarding whether to cancel the show, but I don't personally really buy that morality was the only factor in the decision. Like, a lot of money went into financing that show. Like, surely that was a factor. I tried to research whether any major brands cancelled their runway shows that season and couldn't find any, but I did find out that Burberry cancelled their runway show in autumn-winter 2022 because of the death of Elizabeth II. Like, I get that Burberry is a British heritage brand, but I do find the contrast between these two quite interesting. Like, the fashion industry doesn't miss a beat when Putin invades Ukraine, kills civilians, and creates a refugee crisis. But one monarch dies and the Burberry show is cancelled. It's not that I think talking about political issues should be out of the jurisdiction of a fashion designer. After all, in this show Demna is connecting to a lived experience as a former child refugee himself. The issue I think it's worth pointing out, however, is that he's making these statements within a context which isn't very well suited to enacting any kind of real political change. I'm not saying everyone who goes to fashion shows doesn't give a shit about refugees, but fashion houses are businesses ultimately, and I'm personally very suspicious of profit-driven cultural production being marketed as effective political action, which I slightly found was the case here. Also, in Ukraine's case, their refugee crisis was caused by Russia's invasion, but many people across the world are also forced to migrate due to extreme economic inequality, and more now than ever, climate change, which is what the Balenciaga show was about initially. I did some research on carrying sustainability, and it definitely has taken steps to investigate how it can make its production more sustainable. They have a sustainability lab in Italy. To his credit, François-Henri Pinault has admitted that Kering's production needs to decrease in order to reach its goal of cutting emissions by 40% by 2035, which I guess is quite rare for a company which survives on selling people commodities. But that, of course, doesn't stop him zooming around in his private jet, which he has made impossible to track. His climate activism is definitely giving do as I say, not as I do. I also find it hard to believe that Francois-Henri Pinault himself is engaged in politics that seeks to benefit the lives of migrants and refugees. Like, I guess it's good that he gently semi-condemned Trump's Muslim ban on Twitter/X, but I do think it's relevant to point out that part of the appeal of populist right-wing politicians is that they are adept at creating scapegoats, usually migrants, for problems that are actually arguably to do with inequality. Even in the Muslim ban critical tweet, Pinault's wording was quite illustrative of a kind of neoliberal view of migration, insofar as it praises migration which benefits corporations. The tweet in question read, "At a time when diversity is at stake, I want to reaffirm how crucial this value is to me and to caring," he said. "Diversity of origin, opinion and belief is part of our identity and our success." I don't know. I just think it's quite different to saying he supports the rights of Muslim migrants, refugees, full stop. It feels like he's saying the ban is bad because it depletes caring's hiring pool. And so while I get that maybe it's good that, unlike Bernard Arnault, who had meetings with Trump straight after his inauguration, that Henri-Francois Pinault criticized the ban, I do also feel like Pinault decrying Trump's racism is an example of him participating in woke liberalism, which distracts from the issue of inequality that as a billionaire he sits at the heart of. This is obviously not an original point, but I don't think the Trumps of this world would have as much political potential if people felt like their lives were better, and if they were presented with a viable alternative to hypercapitalism, which didn't center migrants as its enemy. At the end of the day, caring is a business intent on wealth extraction. Every political stance Balenciaga takes functions within its brand identity, an identity which is sold to consumers for profit. Henri-Francois Pinault can talk as much as he likes about climate change and how he loves diversity, but the aim of his company is to make money. It's not to solve climate change or the refugee crisis. This analysis may seem like a jump from talking about a clearly very personal runway show by Demna at Balenciaga, but I don't think it's too much of a stretch to argue that using the Ukrainian refugee crisis as creative input for a form of cultural production that services the financial interests of the ultra-wealthy represents the same kind of cultural capital for wealth accumulation swapsy I described in the Manchester rave scene, and its aesthetic co-option by property developers. A refugee-themed runway show may be inspired by the personal experience of Demna here, but that doesn't prevent Francois-Henri Pinault and other elite financial interests from being the ultimate beneficiaries of that cultural production. The corporate, profit-driven structure of the business Demna finds himself in also dictates the way he thinks about sustainability, in my view. I found this interesting podcast where Demna talks to Imran Ahmed of the Business of Fashion about how couture is the most sustainable form of consumption. It's in 2020. He's definitely onto something in the sense that couture is made to order, and so it doesn't require the use of large factories. And because so few garments are made, it's easier to have a very transparent supply chain. I guess the thing that struck me about this notion, though, is that, as the podcast mentions, there are apparently around 200 women in the world who can buy couture because of the cost. I don't think it would be a huge reach to argue that the business of couture only exists because of extreme inequality. After all, capitalism has winners and losers, and if assets are allocated in a way that means that one person is able to spend hundreds of thousands of pounds on a single garment, it also means that there are people on the other end of the economic spectrum who won't have enough money to afford food. This isn't to criticize the practice of couture itself and to say that it's bougie to take hundreds of hours to make clothes. I find it kind of tiresome when people imply that everyone who is interested in fashion inherently has no interest in social issues. And it's not to denigrate the craft of a fashion designer and their team of extraordinarily talented ateliers. It's just that in the present hyper-capitalist system, the only thing that sustains this type of industry is the extreme wealth owned by a tiny handful of people. And in Balenciaga's case, this also goes for most couture ateliers. Couture is also semi-funded by ready-to-wear, and ready-to-wear is often funded by the sale of monogrammed handbags and accessories. There's a whole weirdly interlinked train of using the profits from commodities middle to upper class people actually buy in order to realize slightly more creative ambitions in ready-to-wear, and even more so in couture. I guess I just find this engagement with environmentalism very symptomatic of a type of woke-washing/mental gymnastics that people like Demna, as the face of Balenciaga, engage with in order to present the corporate interest they represent as a social good. One of Demna's solutions to the climate crisis being the production of couture, which in its present state is arguably a symptom of a broken economic system. Again, not saying that creating couture is inherently bad, but we live in an era of growing inequality and environmental collapse, and we arguably need wealth redistribution to alleviate these issues. We don't necessarily need the ultra-wealthy to buy €70,000 coats. I think this is generally what happens when corporations are allowed so much power, and we end up leaving issues such as climate change in their hands. Their profit margins will always come first, and you end up with Demna touting the green credentials of couture, when really a large wealth tax on billionaires would be much more effective in raising the money that governments around the world need to deal with the climate crisis. So I started this video by discussing social movements and their co-option by corporate interests, and I'm henceforth sloppily attempting to perform a kind of intellectual looping back, if you will. Basically, my take on Demna is that some of his ideas are somewhat unique given the fashion space he occupies, but I think the politics stuff is bullshit. Beyond this, I think the infamous ad scandal of December 2022 proved that not only do corporate interests neutralize the power of cultural production which seeks to be political, but it also, in my view, patrols the boundaries of that artistic expression. So I'm not going to go over the details too much, as it's all on the internet anyway. Balenciaga released a bunch of campaign images featuring Isabelle Huppert reading some papers which later turned out to be concerning the banning of child pornography. At the same time, they also released an ad featuring children with BDSM-looking teddy bears. To be honest, I think the controversy surrounding this mess-up was totally blown out of proportion. I just think anything to do with pedophilia is kerosene in terms of stoking the fires of outrage. It seems like hating pedophiles is kind of a unifying stance in this polarized political landscape we find ourselves in. So I guess it's good we have this consensus. But yeah, the fuck up was obviously seized upon by right-wing conspiracy Pizzagate adjacents. Also, it was kind of easy to add fuel to the fire due to Demna's deliberately edgy self-curation. Like when he wrote on Instagram in 2016, someone wrote that Lotta, Gosha and I grew up on child pornography and radiation from Chernobyl, which is why we're so fucked up. Lotta Volkova is a stylist, and Gosha Rubchinsky is a streetwear designer who allegedly genuinely pressured a 16-year-old boy into sending nudes. While I think the scandal was blown way out of proportion, and there's a good video by Justine Leconte I've linked below explaining why the scandal was most likely caused by accidental internal failures at Balenciaga, I also think it feels like quite childish arrogance on the part of Demna to think that the kind of art school edgelordism with which you'd make a statement saying you grew up in child pornography could still work for you once you're at the helm of one of the biggest and most prestigious fashion houses owned by a billionaire. Also, he was 35 when he said this, and he'd already been at Balenciaga for a year. I'm not sure it's relevant to the point I'm trying to make to focus on this statement too much. I guess I just find it a bit cringe that he said this. I just think it's embarrassing. It still calls for debate about just how involved Demna was in terms of the concept for the BDSM Kids Teddy Bear campaign. And I think a lot of people working in the fashion industry chalked it up to mismanagement and internal failures, as opposed to deliberate intent. I don't know. I do think Demna was always kind of teetering on the edge of a lot of social acceptability for clout, evidenced in the Chernobyl statement. I guess we'll never really know exactly how everything went down. General panic ensued after the release of the campaign. Demna described it as the worst period of his life. Entire YouTube and Instagram careers were launched off the back of the conspiracy theories surrounding Balenciaga. The element of the story that interests me the most, however, is that as soon as Demna's position at the brand was threatened by the ad scandal, Demna's work at Balenciaga suddenly changed. All of the ironic edgelordism disappeared, with his autumn-winter 2023 show featuring no Kering branded jumpers, no McDonald's-inspired footwear, and no BDSM. Also no statements about refugees. It was just about clothes, Demna said of his 2022 comeback show. Fashion has become a kind of entertainment, but often that part overshadows the essence of it. In the last couple of months, I needed to seek shelter from my love affair with fashion, and I instinctively found it in the process of making clothes. I just find this statement really interesting and so demonstrative of the way that large corporate-owned brands talk about their creativity, because he's completely avoiding referencing the corporate backdrop to what happened, using phrases like instinctively and love affair. It's not that I don't think the pedophilia scandal wouldn't have been an incredibly stress-inducing and emotional period for him, but ultimately the main things at stake during this whole debacle were Balenciaga's reputation and share price and Demna's career. We'll never see the correspondence between Kering and Demna during the scandal, but I suspect the subtext of most of it was distract people from this or you're fired, rather than take comfort in your creative practice. Essentially, I just find it very difficult to believe that Demna's emotional turmoil and career imperative to produce another non-controversial season for Balenciaga matched up in such a perfect way. The idea that he seamlessly turned his pain into art at just the right moment. The reason I want to do this kind of annoying language analysis is just because I think it's really demonstrative of the point I've been trying to make in this video. These sentiments, in the case of Demna, of critiquing the fact that fashion has become a kind of entertainment, the critique only exists within the context of a brand trying to sell you stuff. Like he's suddenly realised it's bad that fashion has become a kind of entertainment at the point his position is threatened, and his subversive attitude is no longer permissible. He also said fashion can no longer be seen as an entertainment, but rather as an art of making clothes. I think the reason so much of the current fashion industry isn't about the art of making clothes is because it's so driven by a billionaire-backed project to drive really intensive consumption. The impetus for new creative work by fashion designers has a completely unmediated relationship with the demands of the hyper-capitalist landscape that fashion inhabits. And the way Demna switched from making statements about refugees and late capitalism to suddenly deciding fashion needs to be about the art of making clothes again, just in time for autumn-winter 2023, this is part of the same landscape. In the example I previously used of Karl Lagerfeld appropriating feminism in his Chanel show, I think lots of people would call bullshit on the idea of Karl Lagerfeld being a feminist. There's a texture to his pop feminist appropriation, which I almost find funny because it's so blatant. I think what I find more concerning with Demna is that he claims that his emotional reactions to events are what drives his creativity, the SS 2022 show being about refugees, but in the event of a scandal that threatens his position, he completely changes his style. To me, it just seems like someone who's made a career out of flirting with controversial topics just enough to create a buzz, finally falling foul of his audience for landing on the one topic most people are universally enraged by, i.e. pedophilia. To be honest, I'm grateful for the fact that the ad scandal occurred, because it perfectly displayed the shallowness of Demna's convictions, both artistically and politically, and also the impotence of ironic critiques of capitalism. Because Kering weren't threatened by any of the subversive late capitalist output Demna was producing prior to autumn-winter 2022. They didn't give a shit about the Kering jumpers because they weren't harming their profit line. In Postmodernism, Jameson raises the question of why Andy Warhol's work is not politically radical, writing that Andy Warhol's work in fact turns centrally around commodification, and the great billboard images of the Coca-Cola bottle or the Campbell's soup can, which explicitly foreground the commodity fetishism of a transition to late capital, ought to be powerful and critical political statements. If they are not that, then one would surely want to know why, and one would want to begin to wonder a little more seriously about the possibilities of political or critical art in the postmodern period of late capital. In fact, since 2012, Campbell's Soup has had a licensing agreement with Andy Warhol's estate to use Andy Warhol's imagery of the soup cans on a variety of merchandise, arguably illustrating the seemingly never-ending cycle of creating ironic art about brands. I just think it's been very proven for some time that this cycle consists of both artists and brands co-opting each other's imagery and both being able to profit from it. Which is fine in and of itself, but I think to pretend that it's subversive in the way that many critics interpret Demna's work is kind of naive. After all press is good press, and Kering branded jumpers and McDonald's-inspired footwear only increase brand awareness, which in turn often leads to larger profits. Only when profits are at risk, such as in the case of the ad scandal, do you end up with a situation in which Demna has to censor his work. I also think what Demna represents as a designer, i.e. someone who is primarily a businessman intent on creating a brand and who is happy to work within the confines of a corporate structure which patrols his expression, functions within a system Mark Fisher would describe as capitalist realism. In his book of the same name, Fisher references Jameson, but distinguishes his theory from postmodernism by arguing that in the 1980s, when Jameson published his thesis, there were still in name at least political alternatives to capitalism. Fisher published in 2009, a year after the financial crisis, which was to usher in massive bank bailouts and huge waves of austerity inflicted on citizens as a result. Fisher seems to describe a kind of mass resignation to capitalism, a herd acceptance towards it as an ideology. The reason I think this is relevant to Demna is that despite being a multi-millionaire, I couldn't find exact figures, he still seems resigned to accept the fashion industry as it is, despite the fact that he now has to censor so much of his own art. A cynic would maybe question whether BDSM teddy bears with kids is really an art worth defending, and I'll admit I'm not the biggest fan of Demna's oeuvre, just because I feel like he relies heavily on marketing spin to sell his clothing as opposed to good design. Like a logo hoodie originally retailing for £975. I explained earlier my issue with this. I think selling simple items at prices like these contributes to a logic which allows some garment workers' labour to be devalued in comparison to others, purely for reasons of exchange value. But these issues aside, it just seems strange and depressing to me that in spite of a scandal which was blown way out of proportion, and a period which Demna described as the worst of his life, he still seems happier to stay at Balenciaga, penned in creatively by the pressure of not causing another scandal, even though he's kind of built his legacy on being the subversive enfant terrible of fashion. I guess it's hard to say from an outside perspective. Clearly the perks of being creative director at Balenciaga outweigh the negatives for him, but it kind of seems like a lot to sacrifice. In the Business of Fashion podcast I referenced earlier, Imran Ahmed references a previous conversation he had with Demna about the pace of the fashion industry when Demna was at Vetements in 2016. Referring to COVID, Khan says, "We're still having that conversation so many years later. And now, we've all paused for 16 months, the system kind of got interrupted, but it feels like it's snapping back." Demna replies by talking about the general issues in fashion and how some of the sustainability gripes can be cured by couture. But the way Khan was questioning him made me feel like in the previous conversation Demna's stance had been a bit different. I did some Googling and found this article in which Khan says to Demna, "You expressed a shared sense of frustration with the industry among the wider Vetements team. What types of things were you talking about?" Demna responds, "Well, basically, the frustration was with the cycle. The creative cycle that didn't really coincide at all with the production side, and the demands of the number of pieces that we had to make. The pieces became kind of soulless, because they had to be made, but didn't really have a reason to be. That was the most frustrating part for me. You need to have a jersey top because that's what the market requests. I can't do a jersey top at the moment, I just found this answer very fascinating, because for me it suggests that there was a point in time in which Demna was critical of the present fashion industry and its capitalist intransigence. That frustration, what some might even call idealism, didn't seem to be there in the more recent Business of Fashion interview in 2020. And when traced alongside his tenure at Balenciaga, it just feels like Demna has resigned himself to the fashion industry as it is. This video has taken a long time to put together because I'm lazy. And in that time, Demna put out his fall 2024 show, which saw a return to some of his tendencies of appropriation of lowbrow culture. Velour tracksuits, boots that look like Ugg boots. It was all quite Y2K to be honest, which I'm a bit over by now. Balenciaga partnered with Erewhon, which is a bougie supermarket chain in America, and made some tote bags and a charcoal juice drink with them. So yeah, Demna's definitely back to his old postmodern antics, at least on the tamer end of the spectrum. As I've suggested, I don't think this stuff is subversive or challenging. It's just a diet version of what he was doing before, and I thought most of the clothes were ugly and boring. This is the end of the video. I'd just like to add before I finish that this is not meant to be a hit piece directed at Demna himself. The piece I referenced by Lauren Collins, writing in The New Yorker, actually really intrigued me regarding Demna's practice and artistic evolution. I was particularly interested by Collins's description of his fascination with sociological uniforms and how they convey status, in part due to the period Demna and his family spent in a camp for immigrants when they moved to Dusseldorf when he was 21. The point I've tried to make in this video is not that Demna as an individual is this shitty, calculating person with no integrity whatsoever. It's more that his work represents, quite explicitly in my view, what Frederic Jameson and Mark Fisher describe in their respective books, Postmodernism and Capitalist Realism. It's this incapability to reimagine the fashion industry as anything other than a mechanism to sell commodities, in spite of growing inequality and climate breakdown. When observing Demna's career, I'm left with the impression that to be a successful fashion designer now is to toy carefully with the outer edges of what is seen as culturally acceptable or even slightly perverse, only to mine these areas in order to generate profit for a company owned by a billionaire. There don't seem to be any other models for success in the industry. Even people at the top seem incapable of suggesting alternatives.